never really learned how to pray until I started attending protests. Now, I'm not saying that I didn't pray. In fact, you might not be surprised to learn, some of you have gotten to know me over the last year, that even as a child, I've always been a prayer person. I always liked going to services. I would follow along in the Siddur. I would sing quite loudly. I would listen attentively to the rabbi's sermon. I would get upset with my parents when we were running late. And for me, it actually went further than this. I actually have a home video of my brother and I playing synagogue. Some kids play house. Some kids pretend to be puppy dogs. Well, my brother and I pretended to be the rabbi and the cantor of a mid-sized suburban congregation. And our congregants were the organized rows of stuffed animals and beanie babies that we had laid out along the living room. And our 4-year-old brother, who we forced to sit and watch us. We would lead the prayers, asking the stuffed animals to rise and sit at the appropriate times. And we even made, I think, some very insightful jokes mocking the mannerisms of our childhood clergy. So I've always been leading tefillah. I've loved the music. I'm drawn in by the words. But I think that over the last number of years, as I've started to learn and think more about social justice movements and about the similarities between protest and prayer, I've really begun to understand something true about what it means to pray and what it means to put prayer into the universe. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel described his experience walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, as a moment of prayer. He explained, for many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling. And yet, our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt like my legs were praying. And when I read this quote, I think, of course, here is a great rabbi, a master of prayer and spirituality, Rabbi Heschel. So when Heschel prays, it must be an experience of immense power. And so when he protested, he experienced the same power that he experienced in prayer. And in some ways, this has been my experience of protest as well. One poignant example comes to me from 2014, when I attended the People's Climate March. I joined nearly 300,000 people from around the world marching in New York City to urge the United Nations and their leadership to take bold and swift climate action. This was the largest climate change march in the history of the world. The streets were flooded with signs and chants and rows of people. And most beautifully to me, there was a special section for people part of faith communities to march together. The prayer that day included voices across the lines of faith, race, and class. And in that moment, in the sea of people marching down Central Park West, it truly did feel like something was on the brink of change. That a group of people this size simply couldn't be ignored. And some change did, in fact, come. A year later, international climate change action was taken in the form of the Paris Climate Accords, countries making commitments to dramatically reduce their emissions. This was a very, very powerful experience. But to be honest, that very morning, I really considered staying home. Because what exactly was this protest asking? The group was loud, but the problem was so very big. And the protest was organized, but the problem was very disorganized, affecting almost every part of society. And second, and this was probably more important, who would notice if I wasn't there? What difference was my presence in the crowd actually making? It's possible that someone in this room has had that experience of showing up to tefillah before. If I miss one, what difference will it really make? Moments of protest do bring intense, powerful feelings of collective action, of communal rage, and of hope for the future. But I don't believe that it would have been lost on Rabbi Heschel that protest movements are often unsuccessful in their moments, and often for many, many years after. Heschel entered a civil rights movement that had existed for decades before that march, and one that continues until this very day. And today, despite commitments made by all of those countries in the Paris Climate Accords, only one of the world's top polluting countries is on track to meet their commitment. So perhaps the power of the march was just a spectacle. For what really did it change? Could it be possible to pray with one's feet, to feel good in the moment, but it means marching towards a goal that ultimately will remain unfulfilled? A protest march, while called a direct action, is often anything but direct. It's a way to stake a claim, to build community support, and to mold the narrative around a value that society may be ignoring or overlooking. And this is how I start to think about prayer. Prayer is a force that is personally, societally, and cosmically powerful, but it's also a practice that is mysterious. It's a practice that promises transformation and yet doesn't show us the direct, straight pathway forward. My prayers are not always immediately answered, at least not in the way that I may have hoped. So this is why I pray. I offer prayer because my reaction of wonder to the world draws me towards making an offering. It's what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel described as a natural reflex to our radical amazement towards the world. I do my best to open my eyes, to allow myself to be amazed by the world, and then out flows a song. Prayer is both about the offering, the baruch, the blessed, and also about who the offering is going towards, the atah, the you. And even if we don't know who the atah is, who the you is that we're actually praying to, it doesn't discount the fact that we're feeling moved to make an offering in the first place. And I pray in spoken words, because in Jewish tradition, words change the world. Deep in our Jewish theological tradition, we're taught that worlds shape reality. It starts in the very beginning. We're taught that God creates the world literally through words. And when I read that opening chapter of the book of Bereshit, and I hear God say, Vayehi or, let there be lights, I don't read it so metaphorically. Because I know in my own life the way that my words and the words of others do shape my reality. Words that are a creative force, and words that are such a destructive force. And at its core, I know that Jewish prayer changes myself and the world in a non-linear way. The rabbis have always both prescribed regular prayer as part of Jewish ritual and also highlight some of its limitations. The sages of the Talmud teach that if a person sees their house burning far in the distance, they shouldn't pray for their children to be safe. Not because it's not an important concern, but because the outcome of this particular case has already occurred. And according to the sages, God cannot or will not change the past. And petitionary prayer is limited in Judaism as well. The Amidah that we say on Shabbat morning is much shorter than the liturgy that we recite during the week, because we're encouraged not to make any petitionary prayers on such a holy day. These limitations are difficult, and they're perhaps a quite misunderstood part of Jewish prayer. And they've become specifically more difficult for Jews since the Holocaust. Because how could God let something like this happen? And if all of the prayers at that time went unanswered in a most desperate moment, what is the worth of prayer at all? The truth is that this question is not unique to the Holocaust. It's existed as long as the Jewish people have existed. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites cry out to God in their period of bondage, And at a certain point, God hears their cries, remembers the covenant that God made with Abraham, and takes notice of the Israelites. And the rabbis are quite interested in trying to figure out, why did God intervene at this particular moment and not sooner? And they offer many answers, but in the end, it's not so clear why God would ever tarry when the Israelites were in such pain, were experiencing such suffering. At the end of the day, I pray because I like how I feel when I pray. I like directing my feelings and needs and wants and hopes into a word, devekut, a word that our mystics use to describe a clinging towards deep connection to the world and to God. Because words mean something to me, and because I truly believe that they do shape reality, I think that we should sometimes revise our siddur when appropriate, so that we can truly say what we mean. And because prayer is an offering, I try my best to give it with a full and open heart, to be grateful to be able to give. And when I march, I try to pray with my feet, not expecting that my marching or my protest will instantly change the world, but rather I want to think of my protest as an offering, as a tefillah that connects me to justice and points me in the direction of the winding road towards real and lasting change. Professor Zeynep Tufekci in the Atlantic magazine writes that protests work, but not in the way that we might think. In fact, she explains that protest marches often look like failures in the short term, but decades later can be marked as unwavering successes. She explains that protests are not successful simply because people have marched in the streets, but because they direct attention towards an injustice and that they can truly change people's minds. Protests work because protesters can demonstrate the importance of a belief in society and let authorities understand that their unjust actions will be opposed. And protests work because they're often a gateway between casual participation in a justice issue and lifelong activism. Each of us has a prayer and protest practice. I hope that by coming to this space, to this synagogue, we hear the ways in which our prayer connects us to what we find most meaningful, the ways in which it shifts something inside of us. And if you're not hearing it yet, that's okay, because it's a practice. I surely hope that my prayer and your prayer feels different 10 years from now than it does today. Every spiritual practice involves taking an action and then doing the very difficult work of reflecting on it. So wherever we pray, be it in the synagogue or in the streets, let's remind each other that change will come, that justice will come, and that our prayers will be answered, perhaps not in a linear way. Let's continue to offer something we call reach nichoach, a sweet aroma that comes up through our words. Shabbat shalom.